All right, guys. So we are joined today by Shayna and Daniel, and they are respectively physical therapists and data scientists, part of the K2 Sciences and Kaivan team. And what we'd like to kind of get into today is this recent announcement from the American Physical Therapy Association, APTA, in partnership with a company called Valve to introduce more technology into physical therapy. Daniel and Shana, you've been both at the cutting edge of technology and therapy and data science. Um, Dana, what's your reaction to the recent announcement from the APTA, and how do you think physical therapy clinics are reacting to it?
I'm super excited in general about the announcement, and I think that it's kind of been a long time coming to see how the world of physical therapy and, in my case, athletic training tries to adopt new technologies and adopt kind of the world that Shane has been living in a while as a sports scientist, um, where for a couple of years now we've had access to really cool pieces of tech, particularly from Vault. We use them in the clinic of force plates and their dynamometers and that kind of stuff. But all kinds of different tech, and really trying to figure out how physical therapists can capture that data, make it super usable, and then just help the patients in front of us. We've struggled for a long time to do that. If you don't have someone like Shayna in front of you who can help you analyze that data and figure out what's important and then spit out a nice report for patients. So I'm excited to see that it's going in a new direction. And yeah.
That's great. Shana, you've been on the front lines of data science at the elite levels. You've obviously worked at the Chargers and other organizations of that nature. Data is a very complicated idea, and you recently really started to delve into the area of the physical therapy clinics and them using data. How do you see them reacting to data from all these unique technologies from companies like Vault and others?
I think I see a couple different scenarios. One is I do think PTs are using data in their daily practice. It's just not as high of a level as it would be with some of this technology. So even something as simple as measuring girth of your thigh, like that's data. Um, but these companies are making more detailed data and more specific data, way more accessible to clinics. So that's one side of it is yes, they have been using data. The other side of it is there's going to be a learning curve into implementing this high level technology into the clinic. I mean, for reference, I'm a sports scientist. I did my undergrad in kinesiology and then did grad school in biokinesiology, studying specifically sports science. And even collection of data and understanding how to use this equipment, there's a huge learning curve with it. So I see both sides of it. Like one, I think physical therapists will understand that this is how things are going to progress and that they need to start using this type of data in the clinic. And then there's the other side of it on like, okay, how do we learn how to use this one? How do we even make sense of the data? Two, how do we understand what we need to buy? Um, so two sides.
Definitely. There's a lot of things that go into it. There's the purchasing side, what to get, the cost of it, how do you afford it, and then how do you use that data, which obviously has its own levels of complexity that most physical therapists might not have had the chance to get exposure to so far. I think for today, let's kind of dissect the cost side of it. Daniel, you're obviously knee deep in it. You're a practicing physical therapist in Pasadena, working for a therapy company called Aspire Physical Therapy. You are on the cutting edge of technology. You use force plates and anemometers, and force frames, and you name it. You're in the middle of it. And you also work for a therapy clinic that is a insurance-based physical therapy clinic. And it sounds like in the industry, there's really a bifurcation. You have physical therapy clinics that are insurance based, and you have therapy clinics that are cash based. And I'm sure there are probably a few that are a mixture of the two, but I'm sure they're more of the outliers than anything else for right now. It sounds to me that we should focus a little bit on the majority of the clinics in the country, which tend to be insurance-based providers. How do they find ways to finance new technology? And of course, most physical therapy clinics are margin constrained. They're workflow optimized. So from the cost perspective, Daniel, can you give us an idea of how do physical therapy clinics how could they afford the technology they're getting? Are there codes available? Is there extra revenue stream to generate from it? But give us an idea of how do clinics afford this stuff?
That is a super good question, and lots to unpack there. But you're totally straight on. You're totally right that we've been saying we want better data, and there's cooler pieces of technology out there that clinics like ours want to get. Like we've invested in force plates and dynamometers and different visual and cognitive reactive systems and all kinds of stuff. But at the end of the day, if it's not feasible financially for the clinic to invest in the personnel to learn it, I think is a big piece of it. And in the actual data you're getting to try to figure out how to make that, you know, so important and so helpful for your patients that it has a financial benefit. Because we live in the real world in the insurance side of PT, and just because you have a cool piece of technology that helps you capture a ton of data points doesn't necessarily mean it's going to pay for itself and you can afford to use that with every patient who walks in the door. And I think in a lot of the conversations we've had in our clinic is taking these really complicated pieces of tech and not so much making them perfect, but making them easy and figuring out how I can use, for example, a force plate with a patient and have this set up really quickly streamlined and taught in our clinic and taught in our culture with the aids that we have in our clinic and that kind of stuff so they can set up a patient on a force plate. So for example, if I take a patient through a evaluation and I want to capture data on a squat asymmetry. It's the first time I've seen them, and I just want a baseline of how much they're willing to load their right leg versus their left leg in a squat. If it takes me an extra 5 or 10 minutes to input that patient's data into a iPad, explain the test to them, try to get that going, I'm probably not going to fit it into my eval because that 5 or 10 minutes could be spent explaining something else to the patient, or it could be spent doing my documentation, which I'm already behind on anyways. So there's a lot of real world constraints that stop you from using the tech. And the first thing is making it easy. So in our clinic, making it part of our culture and part of our education system with our aides has been really helpful. So if a patient comes in, I already have a PT aide who is applying to physical therapy school, who I've taught how to use the system. And when we have a patient come in, he's already made them a profile in the Vault system. It has their name and their date of birth and everything. So in case in the moment I'm like, ooh, you know what? Now I've decided I want to measure shoulder external rotation strength in that moment or a force plate squat. I can just ask him, hey, can you grab the dynamometer real fast? As part of my eval, he can bring it in, and 45 seconds later, I can measure something and make it really tangible. So the first side of things, I think, is making it that 5-10 minute setup process and taking it to 45 seconds in our workplace culture has made it feasible in the PT clinics to actually use this because otherwise we're just constantly running out of time and then I can't treat the next patient and then I'm falling behind on all my other notes and I just can't fit it into a realistic insurance-based clinic. That's one side of the coin. Sorry, I'm rambling here on a lot of stuff. But the second side of the coin is there are some, you alluded to different ways that we can bill for insurances for what we're getting, and ways that we can market some of these technologies to local sports teams or different populations, not all just in sports side of things. That really helps us use this technology and be able to afford it for our clinic. So in our clinic, we kind of had to get creative of the ways that we um, bill our insurances. And part of that is using particularly force plates. But there's some other technologies in clinical scenarios that we can use. to bill for biofeedback training. So particularly if I have a patient that say they're doing that squat or I'm just practicing weight shifting. If they were coming off of surgery and I was telling them, the surgeon wants them 25% weight bearing on that side because that's the amount of weight that that limb can tolerate after surgery. I can now put them on the force plates, do biofeedback training, and get an exact number on what 25% weight bearing is, or be able to actually tell them, no, you're not loading your involved side as much as you think you are after even they are cleared from a surgical perspective. Um, and then we're able to turn around and on the logistics side of things, charge biofeedback training when we're using the force plates, as long as we have a report from that and some objective data that's within our notes that shows how we used that and how we weren't able to get that kind of objective, feedback for the patient in another way. Our insurance companies that we work with, including Medicare, Blue Shield, a couple others, um, I think Aetna has a couple, MedRisk, anyways, have been reimbursing us for biofeedback training, which adds additional coding on top of the therapeutic activity or therapeutic exercise or whatever we're already billing for in our practice. So there's two sides of the coin in summary. One is making it really, really easy for ourselves so it works in our workflow. And the other is when applicable in the right scenarios, we can actually get a direct kind of code for some of that we can charge insurances when we're using biofeedback training.
Gotcha. Thanks, Daniel. That was really insightful. We definitely have experienced the process of educating therapists on how to use data and technology in our own clinics and other clinics as well. Shayna, you've done a large part of that at Kaivan. Part of what we do essentially is help physical therapy clinics better adopt technology from a pricing as well as usage perspective. Shayna, what has been your experience so far training physical therapists in terms of time needed, repetitions needed? Give us kind of your philosophy or approach to training therapists on the usage of data. And obviously, there's so many layers of data and how to interpret it at different levels. Can you kind of walk us through how you train a physical therapy clinic to start to use data, starting out, and eventually, what are your hopes for a physical therapy clinic to be able to do long term?
Yeah, so my approach has been 1 hour long session on Zoom, just on the background of this technology, why we're using it, why it's important, um, and then a brief summary of what kind of information it can give you. And then, secondly, I do a in-person session, depending on what type of equipment each clinic has. It could take like an hour to 3 hours potentially, if they have more devices. And then beyond that, usually I help them with their first couple data collections. And then beyond that, I'm just on call for them if they ever need help. Um, I would say that most physical therapists I work with, that works really well. But there are a lot of little nuances with the technology that, like, even something as simple as like troubleshooting Bluetooth, like if it doesn't come up for a couple months, then like suddenly you hit this crazy roadblock and then I'm getting calls like all throughout the day, like, why isn't this working? So I would say like the total process, if you're getting enough reps in per day, per week as a physical therapist using this technology, like I would say at least 6 months at the minimum, especially with all the, I mean, it depends on what company you're working with, but they have a bunch of different protocols and a bunch of different movements and muscle groups that you can measure. So even if you're proficient in one thing, you still have to learn all other 200 tests. So it's sort of an ongoing learning process. I mean, I'm still learning too. Um, so it takes quite a bit of time.
Gotcha. There's definitely there seems to be a significant learning curve involved in adopting technology. Um, we've been through the process a few times with a couple of different physical therapy clinics, and we're obviously seeing this kind of tenure needed to learn the data and technology. And we'd love to jump deeper into the actual data and how therapists are actually using the data, but perhaps we'll schedule that for a different time. I want to go back to one more thing that Daniel talked about, which is the code for biofeedback. Daniel, how much does that code reimburse a physical therapy clinic, and how often can you use it? Can you use it for different technologies in the same visit, or is it just give us kind of the mechanics of using that one code, and what is the number of that code if there's a specific number for the biofeedback code?
Yeah, there is, let me look that up. There is a biofeedback code that we've been using. It's a CPT code. So that is how we bill insurances for our services, whether that's therapeutic exercise or therapeutic activity, neuromuscular reeducation, manual therapy that we might do. The CPT code for biofeedback, I believe, is 909001, 90901. And then every once in a while, we'll use a different one on here that I have is 97750, which is a physical performance test. And sometimes those coding for different performance tests might reimburse us a little bit extra on top of the daily session that we have. What we've found is that uh, all kinds of insurances are different, and at our clinic, we've negotiated different rates with people, and some things are standardized through something like Medicare, and some companies will reimburse us differently. So there are multiple avenues to do that. Some insurances don't reimburse us at all for biofeedback coding, and some insurances will reimburse us up to like 45, I believe $45 for adding that extra biofeedback code for Medicare patients, or even up to like $80 extra for adding that biofeedback code for insurances like Blue Shield. Granted, we're still got to build that in the right scenarios, right? You're not just like throwing biofeedback codes left and right every single day, right? Just for the sake of doing it. We still got to make sure that it's in the right clinical scenario, and those clinical scenarios are most common in the scenarios that I described earlier, where say you have somebody not loading one side as much as you'd like with a squat or a jump or even a push-up. You can get on the force plates and look at how willing you're willing to load one side versus the other, and then use that data tangibly with the patient. Say, hey, look, you're underloading your right side 20%. And all my patients, especially say after like ACL surgery or something, they're like, no, I'm not. I'm squatting evenly. And the eye test, I can no longer tell. And this sometimes comes from Dr. Susan Sigward's research of ACL loading, that it's not so much the interlimb discrepancy, but it's also an intralimb discrepancy of loading their quad versus their hip. We're not going to get too much into the data today. It's more the logistics side of things, but I can't, they pass the eye test. I can't tell that they're offloading, and they feel like they're loading normally. And I'm like, nope, look at the force plates. You are underloading that ACL reconstructed side by 20%, and you had no idea. And using that feedback to then reprogram their brain, actually, it's kind of a brain problem more than a body problem at that point, to load that side evenly and overcome that asymmetry is an example of where we use it most often in force plates. But there's a couple other things where we've used dynamometers from a outside of the Vald sphere, from a company called Tyndek. We've used their handheld dynamometer mostly because it's super cheap and it's really easy to use, and it doesn't have this big complicated operating system. And there's a system on Tyndek where I can get a max volitional isometric contraction, MVIC, for, say, somebody's quad. So I have them kick into the dynamometer. In this case, it's attached to a strap and then an ankle kind of bracelet situation. And I get 100% of how willing they are to load their quad. And then might be for different parameters of if they have a patellar tendonitis or tendinopathy. And I want to load that tendon at, say, 60% intensity for 30 seconds, right? There might be different parameters of loading depending on what stages in a tendinopathy, but being able to really tangibly set that to a 60% of their max, understand that the patient's at a 2 out of 10 discomfort with that. And in some of our tendinopathy research through Dr. Cornelia Kulig, then we actually might want some of that small discomfort in their tendon to elicit the changes in the healing that we want. And we want it at a certain intensity from some other tendinopathy research, some through Dr. Kulig, some through others. But I can really get a tangible effect of what 60% is. And I can set the error for that patient too. If it's their first time, I might set this error to be 50 to 70%. And as soon as they kick into the dynamometer on the screen, they're getting biofeedback where it's showing how much they're pushing, and it gets to that 60%. And then I have them hold for a certain time, and they're getting visual biofeedback on that the whole time, where it shows exactly how hard they're pushing and for how long. And that can be really helpful for people too, because they think that they're loading 60%, but that's just been like kind of a gut check to be like, oh yeah, what does it feel like to you? But now we can truly get objective and try to match some of the research that's out there, but clinically feasibly do that same thing and actually know that we're at 60% because a Tyndec takes, like I said before, like maybe 90 seconds to set up. If it's that fast and if it's that easy and it can give us some really good data, I'm going to use it. So yeah, those are two examples of when we might use biofeedback training for different tech.
So generally, these biofeedback codes vary between, say, $50 and $90, depending on the insurance company that the patient has.
Yeah, yeah. Currently in our clinic, Blue Shield reimburses us really, really well for it on top of, and these are on top of, our therapeutic activity or whatever codes that we're doing, they're add-on codes. Medicare can reimburse us fairly well as well. There don't for sure quote me on this, but I don't believe that they are unlimited, right? Some insurances will have different rules around it or different caps around how many times you can use it, and we're not just like charging it every single time. And logistically, it doesn't make sense to do that with the patient every time. I might do that once every 3 or 4 sessions, and then we're working on something else. So, um, yeah, we might get reimbursed an extra $50 one time we use it. And I'll do it once every couple of weeks or something. Or if we're really working on a tendon problem and I really want to progress that from 50% loading to 60 to 70 to 80, et cetera, to know that we're progressing, then I might use it every session, but it just depends on the individual patient.
So could you use a biofeedback code for a patient for every visit, or at least one visit a week, for an extended period of time? In which case, it would sound like most of the equipment by most of the resellers could could be compensated for via this mechanism.
Yeah, totally. And that's how, we've shopped around and figured out a bunch of different technologies, some on the cheaper side of things, like a Vald, or sorry, excuse me, the Tyndec dynamometer, which, man, I don't know off the top of my head, but I think runs you $150 or something to purchase and to own. And if we use that thing, 3 times a year, it's going to pay for itself. And granted, we're probably using the Vault dynamometer 3 times a week in our clinic and getting reimbursed for that kind of thing because we have 5 different therapists at our clinic and 4 different locations. Um, Probably 15 therapists total, but don't quote me on that. So these pieces of tech, while $150 dynamometer, you know, is a little bit of an upfront cost, but again, that's really on the cheap side of things. That pays for itself right away. Some of the other more expensive pieces of tech that are more complicated from Vald, say, in this example, but it could be from Hawkins or a bunch of different force plate companies. We ran through a financial calculation for our clinic. I don't remember what it was off the top of our head, that it's like, if we only do this thing a couple times a week for just one therapist, but particularly if we get it embedded in our culture and every therapist is using technology to be a little bit more objective. Our motto is kind of like test, don't guess. We're not just like guessing anymore. We're trying to get real objective data. if we get that done a couple times a week, the technology pays for itself. But as we said before, it's not just like investing in technology for the sake of it. You got to make it work in your workflow. You got to make it work for your clinic and all that kind of thing. So figuring out that financial calculation was a big piece for using in our clinic.
Gotcha. Very good. Well, this has been a great session. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. We'll have a lot more during our next session, I'm sure.
Sweet. Thank you.
Thank you.